Julian Hart retired at 67 without fanfare or celebration. There were no streamers, no farewell toasts, no heartfelt speeches from colleagues, not even a signed card left discreetly on his desk. After more than 4 decades working at the city archives, he left the building as quietly as he had entered it for the first time, so many years earlier. His life had always been one of routine. He lived alone in a modest second-floor apartment above a laundromat on Alder Street. The rooms were small, filled with books and papers arranged in carefully considered disorder. His only companions were the soft creaks of the wooden floorboards, the distant hum of dryers downstairs, and the occasional radio broadcasts that marked the passage of days. Each morning had begun with a quiet breakfast at his kitchen table, followed by a short walk to the archives, where he would descend into the basement, room B102, the heart of his world. It was a space most employees avoided, cold, dimly lit, and silent in a way that made people uneasy. The archive room felt like a forgotten wing of time itself. But Julian found comfort in it. He never needed fluorescent warmth or social interaction to feel content, only the presence of records, stories, and memory. His role was simple in description, yet infinite in depth, to preserve the city's documented history. He cataloged paper trails that most people never gave a second thought. Birth and death certificates, marriage licenses, immigration forms, forgotten patents, handwritten letters, shop ledgers, postcards from soldiers, school reports, and crumpled receipts from long-gone businesses. They were items no longer useful in a practical sense, but invaluable to understanding the quiet pulse of human life across generations. Over time, Julian developed a private ritual. As he sorted through boxes of documents, he began to record the names of people whose stories seemed especially poignant, mysterious, or incomplete. He kept a personal notebook, bound in blue cloth, worn at the edges, which he filled with entries he called the Forgotten Register. These were not official records, but fragments. The name of a young girl who sent a valentine to her school in 1927, a man who filed for a marriage license 3 days before disappearing into a war, a woman who tried to start a perfume business in 1956 and never filed a renewal. He didn't know exactly why he did it. Perhaps it was a small defiance against the world's tendency to forget. Or maybe he felt a responsibility to bear witness to those who had quietly passed through time without fanfare. Retirement unsettled him more than he expected. The slow rhythm of unstructured days made him feel detached from the world, as though his tether to meaning had been gently cut. The first week was a haze of quiet mornings and restless afternoons. He attempted to read novels but found them hollow. He reorganized his bookshelves and then undid it the next day. Time, for the first time in his life, became too spacious. The letter arrived 2 weeks after his retirement. It stood out at once, not because of its appearance, which was plain and unmarked, but because of its timing. The envelope was thin and anonymous. Inside, a single sheet of typewritten paper presented a curious message. It referenced his private notebook, the Forgotten Register, a document he never intended to be seen beyond his own eyes. The letter was not accusatory or invasive. It simply acknowledged his efforts, gently noting that others had noticed. It invited him to a place he hadn't visited in years, the public conservatory where the city's botanical garden bloomed in quiet corners and sun-warmed benches, offered rest to passers-by. A time and location were specified. No explanation, no signature, only an initial. Curiosity, more than anything, led him there. On the designated afternoon, he sat on a bench beneath a jacaranda tree in full bloom. The sky was clear, and the air held the faint scent of lavender. He arrived early, as he always did. He waited without expectation. What followed was not a revelation, but a shift, the beginning of one. A woman appeared. She was young, composed, purposeful. She brought with her a replica of the very notebook Julian thought he had left behind, unnoticed and irrelevant. Somehow his quiet effort to memorialize the forgotten had been preserved. And more than that, it had become useful. The organization she represented, though unnamed and unofficial, had taken inspiration from his work. They had followed the trails he'd begun. They had found people, reconnected lives, uncovered lost branches of family trees, and restored meaning to names nearly erased by time. Julian left the conservatory with a folder tucked beneath his arm. Inside was a story. The granddaughter of a woman named Clara, one of the first entries in his notebook. A life pieced back together because someone cared enough to record a name. For the first time in years, Julian felt something that had faded without him noticing. Not pride, not nostalgia. Something quieter, deeper. Relevance. The conservatory visit changed something in Julian. Not suddenly. Nothing in his life ever changed suddenly, but gradually, like how morning becomes day without anyone noticing the exact moment it happens. He returned home with the folder tucked neatly inside his coat. That evening, he placed it on the kitchen table, beside the stack of newspapers he hadn't opened all week, and stared at it while the kettle boiled. For the first time in a long while, he felt that old flicker, the one that had lit up in his early years at the archives, when a single yellowed letter could open a window to a forgotten lifetime. As twilight softened the corners of the room, Julian read every document in the folder. He moved slowly, methodically, just like he had when handling fragile pages that threatened to crumble in his hands. There were emails between archivists, photographs restored from creased originals, and a short handwritten note from someone named Meredith, a woman who had never known her grandmother's name until Julian's entry had pointed to it. It was just a name in a notebook, but to someone it had been the start of everything. The next morning, Julian opened his closet and took out the worn blue notebook, the original forgotten register. He hadn't looked at it since the day he left room B-102. The spine cracked slightly as he opened it. Page after page of names, each with a small note beside them, a quote, an impression, a passing fact, a guess at who they might have been when the photo was taken or the form was filled out. He ran his fingers over the names, half expecting some of them to speak. A man who'd signed a marriage license 3 days before shipping off to war. A woman who'd filed a business application for a hair salon in 1956 and never renewed it. A child's drawing submitted with a census form showing a house with 7 windows and a single dog, labeled Benny. Julian had spent decades cataloging these people, not because anyone told him to, but because someone had to. Now, for the first time, he realized someone else had noticed. The idea made him sit straighter, breathe a little deeper. He wasn't alone in his remembering. Weeks passed and new envelopes began arriving, each marked with the same plain typewriting, each containing a new folder. The archivists, whoever they were, had continued the work he started, not just cataloging but searching, reaching out, verifying, building the human lines that time had erased. Julian fell into a new rhythm. Each morning began with tea and a letter. Some folders told stories of reconnection, distant cousins who discovered shared ancestry. Others revealed quiet tragedies. A man who never knew his father was a poet. A woman who died thinking no one remembered her name, now with a plaque on a library wall in her hometown. It was all made possible because one man, long ago, decided that forgotten people should be remembered. Julian began taking walks again, not aimless ones, but with purpose. Sometimes he'd pass old buildings he'd once filed records for. He'd pause outside the bakery that used to be a tailor's shop and think about the ledger entry he found 20 years ago that said, "Repaired coat for Mr. T. Linwood, paid in coin and song." These memories didn't belong to him, but he carried them just the same. And now, for the first time, others were helping him carry them too. The notebook grew heavier in meaning, though not in weight. One evening, as autumn swept the city with long shadows and golden light, Julian sat on a bench overlooking the river. He had a folder in his lap, this one about a jazz singer from 1939, whose name had been nearly erased from every archive. She'd never recorded an album, never published a song, but her signature had been tucked into a forgotten ledger from a local theater, and that tiny detail had led to a discovery. Her grandson was alive and had never known her name. Now he did. The sun lowered behind the buildings and the wind carried the soft rustle of leaves. Julian sat still, thinking not of his past, but of all the lives quietly touched by something he'd never considered important. Just lines in a notebook, but lines that reached. He no longer needed recognition. That was never the point. What mattered was that someone had seen the notebook and asked the right question. What if we could finish what he started? He folded the folder closed, placed it under his arm, and made his way home, footsteps light against the stone. In his mind, a list of names drifted, a constellation of lives blinking gently in the dark, slowly lighting up again. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. Retirement, once filled with an unsettling quiet, began to feel different. It no longer felt like an ending. It felt like a transfer, from one kind of work to another. Every few days, another envelope arrived. Each one was unmarked and simple. Each contained a new folder. The contents varied. Some were thick with documentation and scanned photos, others no more than a single image and a few lines of typed notes. But they all shared one thing in common. They led back to his notebook. Page numbers were marked. A line from the forgotten register was often quoted at the top, anchoring the story to where it had begun. What began as an archive of impressions was now something larger, a kind of bridge between what once was and what still remained. Julian read everything carefully, often twice. He took notes in the margins and sometimes traced the faces in the photographs with his fingers. Many of the stories were simple. Some were sad. Some were quietly beautiful. There was the boy whose dog drawing from a 1940 census form had been preserved. He had grown up to become a teacher, and the dog, Benny, had been part of family stories for generations. A great-granddaughter, upon seeing the drawing, wept. It was the only surviving sketch of the dog her father had spoken about his entire life. There was the woman who had written a note on a marriage license stating she hoped this time it would last. She had divorced quietly 5 years later. That simple marginal note, preserved in Julian's handwriting, helped her great-niece make sense of a mysterious change in family records. And there was the unsuccessful shoelace inventor, the one who had filed a patent in 1928 and was never heard from again in any record. His great-grandson, a designer in Montreal, had used the patent drawing as inspiration for a new line of sneakers. What began as failure had become a foundation. Each story, no matter how small, stitched a thread through time. Julian never responded to the letters. He didn't need to. There was no return address anyway, and no requests were made of him. The folders came steadily, respectfully, like updates in a silent collaboration. His role, it seemed, was to remember, to read, to know. He started carrying the original forgotten register with him. In cafes at the park, even on long, slow walks along the river, he would occasionally open it and reread entries from years ago. Each line, once a footnote, now held the possibility of becoming something more. The notebook, once a private exercise in quiet preservation, had become something like a seed catalog, each name capable of growth if planted in the right hands. He began to wonder how many more people had been touched without him knowing, how many families had been guided back to an origin because of a name scribbled in a column margin or a face marked with a star in a scanned newspaper clipping. Julian no longer moved through the world as a passive observer. His walks had weight now. Every building, street name, and statue seemed tethered to the quiet record of time he had spent his life collecting. He would pause at the corner of Aldridge and 7th, recalling that in 1913, a local baker had handwrote a daily poem on his receipts. One of those poems had made its way into Julian's hands, faded and torn. It ended up cataloged under Miscellaneous, Literary, Local, but Julian had recorded it separately in his notebook. A love poem, written in pencil, about a woman named Therese. 2 weeks later, that woman's name appeared on a marriage license, filed in shaky handwriting, signed by the same baker. The city for Julian had become a living archive. Autumn passed quietly. Leaves gave way to frost. The air became sharper, and the world moved indoors. Julian stayed near his small radiator, surrounded by folders, papers, and the warmth of memory. One morning in December, a different kind of envelope arrived, thicker, sealed with red wax. Inside was not a folder, but a full index, a list of every forgotten register entry that had led to a discovered story. There were over 70 names on the first page alone. Some entries were marked connected. Others were labeled in progress. A few had small notes beside them, things like awaiting response or descendant unaware, but file remains active. Julian felt an unfamiliar emotion rise up. Not joy, not pride, something more solemn, more permanent. It was the sense of having left a mark, not on paper but on people. He spent that evening reviewing every page of the original notebook. Some names had already been matched, others hadn't. He knew they might never be, but that was no longer the point. The act of recording had mattered, of noticing, of pausing long enough to say, this person existed, this life mattered. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and slow, like ash drifting through silence. Julian watched it for a while before turning off the light. In his sleep that night, he dreamed not of the past, but of a long hallway filled with shelves of books. And in the dream, he walked without hurry, reading the spines one by one. Each book had a name. None of them were his, and yet somehow they all belonged to him. A. Winter settled into the city without ceremony. The sidewalks became quieter, muffled by snow and the absence of hurried footsteps. Storefronts glowed faintly through frost-touched windows, and even the river, so often restless, moved slower beneath its icy skin. Julian's apartment, once cluttered with fragments of forgotten lives, had taken on the feel of a personal sanctuary. There were still folders, still envelopes arriving at steady intervals, but they were now joined by something else. Small tokens. A printed photograph of a family standing beside an old gravestone, newly inscribed. A pressed flower tucked into a note that said nothing. A charcoal sketch of a woman holding a blue notebook. These had no context, no explanations. They simply arrived. He kept them all. They sat on the mantel in quiet company, like a miniature museum to memory. Not of himself, but of the invisible lines he'd helped uncover. He began compiling a second notebook. This one was not for names or notes, but for reflections. Not on the people he'd archived, but on what their rediscovery had meant. For the first time, he found himself writing about feeling rather than fact, about absence, about the quiet sorrow of being forgotten, about the surprising joy of rediscovery, about the importance of small human details, a shoe size on a military card, the name of a dog scrawled in a corner, a handwritten note requesting, "Please keep this safe." He wrote slowly, without pressure, not to complete anything, not to publish or impress, only to say what needed to be said before silence returned. One afternoon in February, Julian visited the archives building for the first time since his retirement. It looked the same. Weathered stone, familiar windows, the slow rhythm of people passing in and out with errands, questions, papers. He stood across the street for a while watching. Then without hesitation, he crossed and stepped inside. The lobby had been updated, brighter. A new digital kiosk replaced the front desk he once stood behind. But when he descended the stairs to room B102, he found it unchanged. Cool air, the hum of old systems, the stillness that felt less like absence and more like deep listening. The new archivist, a young man he didn't know, looked up briefly, then returned to his work. Julian didn't interrupt. He simply walked to the center of the room, placed a small envelope on the table, and paused to let the air settle around him. Inside the envelope was a copy of the Forgotten Register. A clean transcription, no edits, no added stories, just names, dates, and marginal notes. The original as he had written it, now preserved properly, formally, the way the others had always deserved. When he left the building, he did not look back. The days that followed passed with quiet contentment. Julian's walks became shorter as the cold deepened. He visited familiar benches, kept up with the incoming folders, and continued writing in his second notebook. He reread pages from the first one, not to verify but to remember. He no longer worried about being remembered himself. Legacy, he had come to understand, was not something built on recognition. It was left in traces, like fingerprints on old glass, in questions answered, in strangers gently guided back toward their origins, in invisible bridges that let people feel, however briefly, a little less alone in the world. One evening, in the early glow of spring's arrival, Julian sat by the river. The ice had broken. The water moved again, quietly. He held the second notebook in his lap, opened to a fresh page, and rested his pen on the paper without writing. He watched as a child passed with her parent, skipping stones. A teenager took photographs of birds landing on the rail. A couple argued softly, then laughed together. Life went on. Julian smiled. He had spent decades recording the lives of people he would never meet. Now he could feel their presence, not as ghosts, but as echoes, as proof, as part of the great ledger of light that all humans added to, knowingly or not. When the sun dropped below the skyline and the sky turned lavender, Julian closed the notebook, stood, and walked home. That night, for the first time in a long time, he slept without dreams. And somewhere in the quiet corners of record halls and family albums and local museums, the names he had once written by hand were being read again. Not loudly, not famously, but faithfully remembered.